When I'm talking to people, particularly people in the West, I find myself defending the guy, although I don't really want to because it's necessary to criticize him. It really is, while there's still time, while one can maybe have an impact.
Today in American foreign policy foibles, there was an attack by Ukraine on one of Russia's most important oil refineries and industrial cities in Tatarstan. This was a major attack, described as one of the deepest, if not the deepest attack into Russia by drones. And on the internet, on social media, you could see videos of these drones just flying into the city in far eastern Russia, which is a very important place where the oil is being produced. If you look at the reports, what it says is that Ukraine has been systematically targeting Russian oil facilities using Western funding and backing. That puts pressure on Russia, which is a net oil exporter, an energy exporter. It forces them to use more of their oil to supply their people instead of selling it for export, and that reduces their capacity. But what it also does is it increases the price of oil worldwide for even if, yes, these are oil supplies, they're energy supplies that are being used inside Russia. The idea is to impact Russia, but this will also impact the global markets and global trading of energy. And that works at cross purposes with the U.S. policy of trying to keep the price of oil down, trying to smuggle essentially oil tankers out of the Persian Gulf under the nose of the Revolutionary Guard. So this is just a kind of absurd situation and the kind of comical situation that the U.S. gets itself into with its foreign policy adventures. On the one hand, it's trying desperately to get oil out of the Persian Gulf to keep global supplies up and prevent the price of oil and gas from going up and hurting Donald Trump in the midterm elections that are taking place in November. On the other hand, it's helping finance to some extent and bankroll the Ukrainian war effort that is meant to diminish Russian oil capacity and, by extension, potentially reduce global energy supplies. I'm Borzu Dergahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. You can also find me on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on YouTube. Later on in this episode is part 2 of my amazing interview with the author and Syrian-British intellectual Robin Yassin-Kassab, who wrote a book, The Blood Between Us, about Syria and its recent history and the events that took place leading up to the war that toppled Bashar al-Assad. The book also delves very deeply into the months that followed the 2024 collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime. And he talks a little bit about that in the second part of the interview. It's a great interview. I mean, Robin is such a great interview. He has such a great radio voice and such a great podcast voice. I could just listen to his British accent forever just because he just sounds so charming and intelligent, and he is very knowledgeable. And so I would recommend that you do listen in on that interview if you can. But I guess just back to this issue of the American cross purposes in its foreign policy adventures. You know, it was also the Americans that I think probably gave Saudi Arabia the green light to go after the Houthis and are backing Saudi Arabia in its effort to punish the Houthis in Yemen. And the Yemeni Houthis are responding by tightening their grip over the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and preventing energy supplies, constricting energy supplies from getting out of those key Saudi ports, the Yanbu port in particular, along its western seaboard. That has been one of the keys that has kept oil prices somewhat stable globally and prevented them from rising even further. And so I don't understand what the American foreign policy goal is. As I've mentioned before, the Americans and the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates tried to dislodge and weaken the Houthis for like not 1 or 2 years, like for the last 11 years, really. And they failed. Yes, these are not like necessarily good guys. I don't see the Middle East as good guys and bad guys. The Houthis are an authoritarian movement backed by Iran. They don't have a great track record on human rights. They don't fight war in a way that is commendable. They're very aggressive. They are kind of religious zealots as well. And their coalition is as responsible for the tragedy and suffering of the Yemeni people as are other parties in that conflict. And that includes the southern government, the UN-backed government that is in Aden, and other players, including al-Qaeda and the Americans and the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates. I think that the Houthis and Iran are just as responsible for the tragedy of Yemen and for the disease outbreaks and the starvation of people in that country and the really horrific war crimes and deprivations that have taken place in Yemen. But I still just don't understand the logic of the Americans and the Saudis doing this, going after them at this very moment of crucial energy shortfalls. You know, I was all set to talk about how markets are set to rebound despite all of this, because once the Americans recognize and acquiesce that they lost the war, that's when the kind of good stuff will start. That's when the Americans will I thought maybe the Americans would say at that point, like, enough of these misadventures. Let's focus on domestic matters, and let's focus on keeping our country safe instead of going on these foreign policy misadventures. And I thought that that would be really good. That I thought that we're returning some kind of stability and sense of sanity in U.S. foreign policy, especially when it comes to crucial matters such as oil and energy prices, and not messing with the DNA of the global economy and so on, as the United States did when it attacked Iran and triggered the inevitable and totally predictable closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I thought that the U.S. maybe learned, and you saw these indications that Trump was just going to accede to the Iranians, at least for now, and let the markets do their thing and let the economy improve and let consumers stop paying so much for oil and gas and so on. And then you saw this thing with Saudi Arabia, and now you see this thing with Ukraine. Now, like, just one little caveat here. Ukraine could have been acting on its own, but I doubt it. I think that they have to get some kind of green light from their Western backers before taking on something so adventurous as to launching these drone strikes deep, deep in Russian territory. And at least the Americans could come out and publicly condemn it or tell them not to do it again. And they've been doing this repeatedly. It's actually part of their strategy. This will most definitely further rattle global markets. This is not going to just be affecting Russia. And that is something that the Americans need to think about. U.S. foreign policy right now is a shamble of contradictions. They don't know what they want. And so they just basically are throwing feces at the wall, trying to solve various problems, and not very well. They have allies working at cross purposes. This happens all the time for example, in northern Syria, there was a time when the U.S. was backing the Kurdish militias that were fighting ISIS, and also ostensibly, to some extent, backing the Arab rebel groups that were fighting against both ISIS and the Syrian regime. And those two groups started fighting each other. So you basically had two groups of American fighters fighting each other instead of fighting either ISIS or the Syrian regime. And this is the disasters that keep befalling the American foreign policy, because you have, no clearly thought out strategy, really no interagency process. That's completely collapsed at this point. There's no more process in terms of vetting foreign policy ideas and initiatives. It's all done straight out of the White House. And this did not start just with Trump. This started earlier than just Trump. This phenomenon of ignoring or cooking up intelligence to meet a foreign policy objective, it actually started perhaps with Reagan, but it definitely took place in the Iraq War with George W. Bush, kind of starting with a foreign policy objective, or not even objective, starting with a foreign policy notion that is ill thought out and driven by ideology or propaganda, and then working your way backward to try to justify it by cooking up intelligence, coming up with some stupid raison d'etre for launching a war. Oh, they've been at war with us for 47 years, and not looking at the real situation on the ground, not consulting or listening to the experts at the State Department, the CIA, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. This is what happens when you run foreign policy like this. You get situations where, on the one hand, you're risking the lives of sailors and perhaps even U.S. military personnel to get oil out of the Strait of Hormuz, 8 million barrels a day, they are claiming. Let's see if that's true. We'll find out soon enough. Donald Trump's claims are usually rather exaggerated. And then on the other hand, you're encouraging the Saudis to hit the Yemeni Houthis, thereby closing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and keeping oil prices high, while at the same time giving a wink and a nudge to Ukraine as it damages the Russian oil infrastructure, which could also help alleviate the energy crisis in the world right now. So which is it? Which do you want? I mean, is it about toppling the Iranian regime? Is it about keeping oil prices lower? Is it about toppling Russia? Is it about putting pressure on Russia? It's like there's no rhyme or reason to U.S. foreign policy. It doesn't really, the various pieces of the puzzle don't really fit well together. That is something that we're all going to have to pay for eventually. In any case, here's that interview with Robin Yassin-Kassab about Syria post Bashar al-Assad. I want to just read a paragraph here from the book and then just get your comment on it. So there is no need for a conspiracy theory to explain the final fall of the Assad regime. It had already fallen long before, but Iran and Russia had been between them, propped it up, its corpse. By November 2024, Iran and Russia had been removed from the Syrian equation. That meant Assad had to rely on the Syrian army, an army which by this stage was largely manned by forcibly conscripted men expected to give their lives in return for nothing at all. For our daily rations, one said to an international news outlet, we got just one egg and one potato. So that's really the context that you're describing. There's another point that you emphasized in this first chapter, at least, that Hezbollah, which was a celebrated force in Syria since 2006, since it stood up to Israel. Hezbollah was celebrated by both Sunni and Alawites and other groups inside Syria, which is after all an Arab country, and Hezbollah is an Arab group, as this kind of strong force that stood up to Israel,